This is Curious Minnesota, a Star Tribune project that sends staff from the state's largest newsroom hunting for the answers to great questions we receive from you, our readers. We're here to answer everything you want to know about the state's people, places, and culture.
Welcome to Curious Minnesota. I'm your host, Eric Roper. Did you know that Minnesota produces more turkeys than any other state? Now, this is a good conversation starter at Thanksgiving dinner, especially if you're like me and you visit family outside of Minnesota. But it's January, and Thanksgiving has come and gone. So this is just another useful Minnesota superlative to have on hand if you're trying to brag about the state, wherever you are. Randy LaFoy wanted to know how Minnesota became a turkey powerhouse. Here's Randy.
I drive a lot in Minnesota. I see a ton of turkey farms. I see the president usually pardoning a Minnesota turkey, and then I read that Minnesota raises the most number of turkeys in the entire country. So my question is, why does Minnesota have so many turkeys?
Thanks to Randy for that question. This was right up the alley of our agriculture reporter, Christopher Vondracek, who explored the history of Minnesota's turkey industry for a Curious Minnesota story that we published right before Thanksgiving. Here's my conversation with Christopher. Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah.
All right, you have a very interesting job. So tell us a little bit about what you do for the paper, because it's very relevant to what we're talking about.
So I am the agriculture reporter, which I think would be funny to anyone who grew up with me in the small southern Minnesota town of Wells. I was not an FFA. I lived in town, but I was kind of immersed in rural agrarian culture from a young age. And so when I started at the paper, it's been, often my job to go across Minnesota from way up in Kitson County in the Northwest, kind of wheat country, sugar beet area, down to, dairies in southeastern Minnesota, driftless bluff country, to talk about and report on news in farm country of Minnesota.
Okay.
And part of that also includes covering sort of livestock, and we are the number 2 producer of hogs in the U.S., and we're the number 1 producer, kind of far and away, we have been for a couple decades now, producer of turkeys in the country. And so, around late September, I start to get a sort of like spider sense that we're going to need turkey content.
Thanksgiving is coming.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we did the story to hit the Thanksgiving deadline, and these podcasts come out later. So I apologize, listeners.
It's like Christmas,
I don't know when this is coming out.
We're actually done with our turkey leftovers now. So this is the last turkey thing of the year.
Either save this knowledge for next year's Turkey Fest or just dole it out around the year as needed. Okay, we love a good superlative. We love a good Minnesota superlative. You already kind of alluded to it. We are the number 1 turkey state.
Turkey Titan, yeah.
Turkey Titan. So when does this all date back to, and give us some other stats?
Totally. Okay, so about 1 in 5 birds in the U.S., 1 in 5 turkeys are produced in Minnesota. Since 2003, we've been the number 1 producer of turkeys in the country, and we were also number 1 from 1968 to 1980, and we first hit the top of the charts in 1959. And it's a bit of an odd spot for us to be for a number of reasons. I spoke with, for this story, Steve Licken, who's the CEO of Jennie-O, and he told me that, because of all the traffic we have of migratory birds over our heads, that those birds can oftentimes introduce disease into domesticated birds. And so we're on the Mississippi flyways here, great duck hunting area, but that means that these birds are oftentimes at risk. Our domesticated, our 40 million birds, our 37 million birds last year, typically we average around 40 million birds across the state, that they're at risk for disease.
Okay, and so, we're a very cold weather state. Is there something about the natural environment that means we have a lot of turkeys, or is that working for or against us? I know the answer, but tell me the answer.
Yeah. So it actually works against us a little bit in some respects, because the domesticated birds like it warmer, first off. When the poults are like young turkeys, they like to be in their barns. I've been in these barns. They keep them over 90 degrees.
Okay.
So farther south would be good turkey area. Also an area away from large, migratory traffic lanes, so to speak, of these wild birds would also be a good area. We have all these lakes. All these wild birds love to stop off at these lakes and hang out on their way farther north. So we're actually not, in a good turkey habitat necessarily.
And so let's get into the why.
Yep.
So one thing you mentioned in the story, and this is not something we get into great detail because there's other stories about this, but like that we have a lot of access to, is it wheat? Essentially?
Wheat and corn. Yeah.
Okay.
They're milling all this wheat and corn we have. It's cheap up here. We have access to it.
So that's the feed.
Yep, feed.
But then we also, I guess the other part of this is just the expertise that people were bringing to bear early on in this, and that's what we're going to talk about.
Yep, we're going to talk about that, yeah.
Okay. And so a lot of that comes down to the University of Minnesota, specifically the University of Minnesota Extension. What is that?
Correct. So for those who go to the state fair every year, you perhaps see signs or up around about the extension. They're not just, running 4-H per se and like judging rabbits, et cetera. The extension has a network of educators who are taking the best science and research that the folks that are faculty and researchers at the University of Minnesota at the St. Paul campus are producing around agriculture, around livestock, around crops. And these educators are disseminating that information to farmers on the ground. It's funded by the state legislature, and it's been hugely important in terms of Minnesota agriculture. It's put us on the map with respect to not just turkeys, but also apples and hog.
Okay. So rewinding, let's go back to the dark days of the pre-number one turkey times. This is
tough times, right?
Yeah, tough times, 1920s or so.
Yeah.
What's going on in the turkey business to the extent that there is one, which there isn't?
It's like Gangs of New York style in the turkey world. There is a lot of sadness out there.
I'm just imagining that. Okay. Yeah.
A pile of turkeys. Some of these flocks that when they were very small flocks 100 years ago, oftentimes overseen or run by farm wives as a way to make money for spending on things in town or for the kids, and they were being decimated by disease. A disease called blackhead was sometimes killing up to 75% of these small flocks. And so, these folks who were raising the birds were trying to contend with disease, and they were making what they could off of the few birds that would survive, and they would sell the birds for meat.
And there really wasn't sort of established practices about how to do this. And you quote in the story sort of a protagonist here, Doc Billings, who we're going to talk about in a second, but he says that this whole thing is crowded with superstitious beliefs. There wasn't even agreement about how to feed these things, right?
Yeah, in fact, a lot of these birds, they had the run of a farm, and they were, if you've ever been to a farm and the farmer is a bit of an eccentric and has a peacock kind of running around, which is, I'm talking about my uncle now in South Dakota, that's kind of what these birds were doing. They would greet you like chickens. And Doc Billings had told my predecessor on the Ag Beat that garbage, quote unquote, garbage may be all right for hogs, but it won't raise turkeys, suggesting that farmers were just kind of, these turkeys are a bit of an afterthought, and particularly their diets were just scraps of things they could find on the farmyard.
Okay. So enter Cora Cook, and she's another protagonist here. So who is Cora Cook? Because she ends up really being a big communication factor and getting the word out, getting science out to the rural areas.
So Cora Cook, she's Ivy League educated, and she comes west to Minnesota in the early 1920s. She's hired by the Extension because they specifically want somebody to go out and interface and work with the women who are raising these turkeys. And the big ask that she has for these farmers is to cull or kill birds on the flocks that are not producing eggs. She wants the flocks' genetics to improve, their productivity to improve by basically breeding and rebreeding those birds that are producing a number of eggs. Okay. And so that's kind of one of the steps forward for the industry is her efforts. And
she's doing this in the early 1920s or so? Okay.
Yes.
So the culling, is that helping things a little bit?
Certainly that brings the industry out of that superstitious world into a world of where we're thinking more kind of commercially and kind of scientifically about husbandry and raising birds. But we still have the problem of blackhead, this disease that's ravaging flocks.
And so Doc Billings, William Billings, he's this veterinarian at the U.
Yes.
Right? Hey, what's the deal with this guy?
He's kind of a fancy dresser. He looks like Harry Truman. Okay. He's like driving around the state. He also has that sort of fancy new ideas about swine production as well. But as far as turkeys, he looks at the flocks and these birds that are dying, and he says, you're suffering from blackhead, and I actually remember a researcher on the East Coast in Rhode Island at the end of the 19th century who figured out how to end blackhead in turkey flocks. Because this disease doesn't really impact chickens, it does prove deadly for turkeys. And he says what you got to do is you got to stop having these things just run around your farm, sort of commingling with the chickens. You got to separate chickens and turkeys. And that is a massive monumental step for the turkey industry in Minnesota as well.
And he has other thoughts about incubation and confined spaces while brooding.
Yeah, keep them indoor. Keep these birds indoors. Separate out the eggs. Let the eggs be incubated not by the bird mother per se, the hens, but let's heat these eggs so they crack and get the little chicks, the poults rather. So he has other ideas, but he's mostly remembered for, again, separating out chickens and turkeys, and that alleviates the problems with blackhead. And it's a pilot program. They start in 6 counties. They expand it to 18 counties. And then by the end of the 1920s, this is a statewide practice. And the number of birds go from roughly 500,000 turkeys in the early 1920s, or the 1920 Ag Census, to close to 3 million birds by the end of the 1930s.
Wow. Okay. And Doc Billings is dubbed in our pages Mr. Turkey.
Mr. Turkey.
Which we're going to talk about in a little bit, but there may have been another Mr. Turkey. There may be many
Mr. Turkeys out there, right. There could be a Mr. Turkey out there right now who's saying, you're not giving me my credit.
Yeah, we're going to give another Mr. Turkey credit later.
Yeah,
but anyway, he was a big name in the turkey business.
He was a big name, yeah.
Okay. So moving forward here, sort of into the 1940s, so Earl Olson, not a name maybe that we know offhand, but we're very familiar with his products. So who is Earl Olson? Right.
So there are probably many folks across Minnesota who know of an Earl Olson near them, but we're talking about Earl Olson of Willmar at the middle of the sort of mid-century, and he was a turkey farmer who decided to kind of start to specialize on turkey production. And he named his turkey business after his daughter, Jennifer, or Jenny. And so we get Jenny O. Turkey starting in Willmar.
Okay.
And it's vertically integrated. So he owns the birds, but he has other farmers that raise them, that feed them, that house them. Today it takes about 4 months for a bird to be raised to, a sort of a slaughter weight. So similar situation, these birds would be raised, they'd be sent off to his processing facility in Willmar.
Okay, so by 1959, we're number one in the country, and as we said, we stayed up there until today, but we've kind of gone back and forth with number one spot. I just want to point out there's a great graphic on the story that was done by Jake Steinberg, who is one of our graphics people. He's a trained cartographer, and he did a map here of where in Minnesota there are more turkeys than people.
Right, it could be a little alarming actually if you live in Little Falls.
Yeah, Little Falls is like that's the hotbed of more turkeys than people. I mean, you said there's around 37 million turkeys a year. Yep. There's only, 6 million or
6
so
million people
in the state. So
there's
many more turkeys than people all across Minnesota.
Correct.
Probably not a surprise, but there's some places where that's more evident than others, Little Falls being the epicenter.
Yep.
Now, Willmar, we noted in the story, is the epicenter of turkey farming. It's not sort of the darkest shade on this map, but that's mostly probably because there's a fair amount of people in Willmar. But tell us about Willmar, because Willmar is sort of the hotbed.
Right. So Willmar is kind of the hotbed of turkey production, and largely because of a company that a lot of folks might not have ever heard of, and they're called Select Genetics, and they're the nation's largest turkey hatchery. And so turkey farms across the U.S. are buying eggs or buying poults or young turkeys, oftentimes day-old poults. They're buying them from Select Genetics.
Okay. And so, you cover this industry. You noted that it's an industry today where women are in many of the leadership roles.
Certainly. So historically, we talked about oftentimes the women of the farm who were raising these birds for a little bit of side money. And, largely today, when you look across the industry, whether it's the current executive director, Ashley Coles of the Turkey Association of Minnesota, or Erica Swatsky, who I featured in a piece about broadband, but she's also the board chair for the Minnesota Board of Animal Health, or Abby Schultz, who's hired by Extension to be working on disease management, and particularly with avian flu, which has been a big threat to the industry over the last 5-7 years. There are a number of women who are in high, important, influential places across the turkey industry still today.
Okay. And then after this ran, did you hear from any readers?
I did. I heard a lot of, the kind of comments that you like to see as a reporter. And I did receive actually one gentleman from a college at the U who said there was another Mr. Turkey.
Okay.
In Minnesota history, which I tried to politely inform to him it was not a governor's decree or anything.
This is an informal name.
Right. I don't know if it's like his jersey is hanging somewhere in some sort of field house, but basically there was a gentleman named Ben Pomeroy who in the mid-century to latter part of the 20th century was an influential veterinarian at the U of M. So kind of as Minnesota,
he's got a building
named after him. And as Minnesota became, a turkey powerhouse, I think he was particularly active in the second chapter of the Minnesota turkey.
Yeah, the challenge with stories is always that you got to focus on something, so you can't have everything.
Exactly.
But we just wanted to mention that.
We don't
want Dr. Pomeroy to not get his due diligence.
Right. Apparently, he was the sort of sequel to Mr. Turkey, and there could be a mix, a sort of Mr. or Mrs. Turkey today somewhere. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. There's probably still a Mr. and Mrs.
Turkey. Seething listening to this.
Yeah. Yeah. Call in or write in if that's you, and we'd love to feature you.
Yes.
All right. Well, Chris, thank you so much. This is a fascinating tale. Again, I think we're arming people with really cool information about our agricultural history in this state. And so people can bring it to their dinner tables or what have you.
For next year.
Next year. Or if they're visiting or visiting somewhere else. Or
if you're sitting on a train somewhere on a flight and you want to educate someone about Minnesota, you can,
Just dole this out throughout the year and then dole it out again at Thanksgiving.
Yeah, land of 10,000 lakes or 37 million turkeys.
Right. All right, Chris, thanks so much. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Thanks, as always, to Matt Gilmer for editing this show. Do you have questions for us or feedback about the podcast? Send us a note at startribune.com. And if you are enjoying this show, please tell a friend about it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Curious Minnesota. We want to hear from you. Ask questions and read more stories online at startribune.com/curious. Our show is recorded at the Star Tribune's headquarters in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and our music is produced by Matt Gilmer. If you like the show, please rate us on iTunes or leave a review. And until next time, stay curious.